The first claim I'm going to make is that I think that a particular period in India, in a context that I think has to be seen as Nehruvian, the cinema achieved full-scale status as a tragic idiom. And I do think that the structure of the cinema to define a tragic form is important, and I'm going to try and substantiate that argument, and I'm going to try and also explore why the tragic needed to be defined and why it's important. We all love our Hindi movies. I think there's no question that everybody here sort of enjoys watching and is even sort of their heartstrings are tugged by the grandeur of black and white. And I think many of us feel that this is, so to say, part of our ideological compromise, that we really ought not to be, we should be watching realist films and political films, but these kinds of melodramas do affect us in certain ways, and we've not analyzed enough or taken this particular phenomenon into the forefront, as it were, because it's clear that that affective power that takes place at that time and in that history surely merits attention, as does the power of the symbolic. If the symbolic normalizes, then it also seems to disrupt. And this is, I think, an important point, the disruptive aspect of the symbolic, which I'm going to be talking about, with its sheer power. The question of how to introduce both the concepts of catastrophic and potentially revolutionary time in this particular idiom of the tragic, the Nehruvian tragic, is eventually going to be the topic of this presentation. Many different filmmakers and artists, including very young filmmakers, actually surrendered their awards, which were awards given to them as students. And I think that there needs to be a form to understand this kind of disruption to the relatively simple process by which the state honors its citizens. Citizens do work, they do good work, they do important work, and the state honors them. What happens when this becomes disrupted? And I think that the disruption question is something that we will come to again and again. A third point, this is a slightly more conceptual point I want to try and make, and that is that when India turned independent, we assumed, as most conditions of independence would normally assume, that we also entered a condition of modernity, and that such a condition of modernity defined both a time and a space that was modern. Such a time and space defined what probably his leading theorist, Benedict Anderson, would call homogeneous empty time, to create what he called an imagined community that was secular, that was not based on pre-capitalist or pre-modern time conditions such as, for example, ethnic structures, and was actually modern, and everybody in the country belonged, if you like, to the same space-time arrangement, what he called unbound serialities. Now, I think that there's a problem with that particular formulation, and I want to basically explore that particular formulation of homogeneous empty time, because it seems to me that we've not explored the capability of that particular kind of time to accommodate disruption. Okay, and that's the point I want to primarily explore. The concept of homogeneous empty time is something that Anderson famously receives from Walter Benjamin, and the famous thesis on philosophy of history, where he gets it from. And many people, long before me, have suggested that Benedict Anderson either is limiting the extent to which Benjamin defines the concept, or may have actually simply got it wrong. That Benjamin is precisely not talking about this form of linear, secular, progressive time, but really was speaking about tragic conditions and messianic sort of time structures as well. Yeah? So I'm going to actually do something here, which is to try and return to the idea of homogeneous empty time, which is the time of nationalism, as it came to be defined in Nehruvian India, to explore a wider and a more complex structure than the linear structures, if you like, that I think that particular tradition of nationalism usually presents. He considered Nehru to be a sad, tragic, lonely, misguided figure. And he cast Nehru almost entirely in tragic terms. I think that most of us would remember that particular idea of a tragic figure of Nehru. And my own interest, I think, in the idea of the tragic idiom as attached to Nehruvian times was something that I think, in hindsight, maybe I got from there. Let's look at what somebody else was doing at 2 p.m. on that 27th of May. Khwaja Ahmad Abbas. I quote from I Am Not an Island: Nehru dead Nehru dead, exclamation mark, Nehru dead. The teleprinter message was hammering away at my brain. At 2 p.m. on Wednesday, the 27th of May, 1964, each one of us, 450 million Indians, died. As the great-hearted Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the heart of the nation, breathed his last. I'm very interested in that form. I mean, let's not go into the hyperbole and so on. I'm just interested in the tragic structure that even someone like Abbas is bringing here. A solemn hush of silence descended on the nation. The farmer in the field, the worker in the factory, the clerk in the office, the housewives at their hearths, the children in schools, each and every one felt the sudden chilly spasm of death. Who lives if Nehru dies? When Nehru died, we died. For Nehru was us, the soul and spirit of India. If it was Gandhiji who raised us out of dust, it was Jawaharlal Nehru who gave us life, who gave us courage and the will to struggle for a better tomorrow. And when Nehru died, we died. Each one of us felt the fatal breath of death. Life came to a stop at 2 p.m. on that Wednesday. And it was literally so, says Abbas, it was literally so for the 60-year-old film director and producer Mehboob Khan, whose devotion to Nehru and his ideals was so great that as he heard the fatal news, he felt a stab of pain in his already diseased heart and saying, "Ab is mulk mein rehne se kya fayda?" He collapsed, never to rise again. But the late Mehboob Khan did not know the miracle of resurrection. Nehru is not dead, Nehru lives. This is, if you like, the Abbas structure that he comes up with. I'll just read a little bit more about the hyperbole, and I'm just very interested in how somebody like Abbas, who is presenting a moment in homogeneous empty time, seems not to think that that particular condition prevents him from an epic construct of what has happened here. The flag of India flies half-mast over Rashtrapati Bhavan that was once the Viceregal Lodge, but is the flag of a free sovereign Republic of India. Each flutter of the flag proclaims the freedom of India and testifies to the resurrection of Nehru. From the sluice gates of the Bhakra Nangal Dam, and I'm going to now talk about imagery that in fact appears in the cinema, from the sluice gates of the Bhakra Nangal Dam, as pours forth the powerful flood of sparkling waters that are bringing new life, new hope, and new prosperity to the once vast arid tracts of the Punjab and Rajasthan, transforming deserts into cornfields and flower gardens. In each glistening ripple of the Bhakra stream, in each ear of corn, which, this is something I'm going to come to, in each ear of corn which raises its proud head to the sun, in each mustard flower that miraculously blooms in the desert, we shall always see the smiling face of Nehru that was, like a sunflower, always turned to the source of all light, all energy, and all hope. The sunflower metaphor is well known to those of us who know our Benjamin. And I want to sort of remind you what, in fact, Benjamin said about the sunflower, because it's not what you think it is. I'm not terribly sure that Abbas knew the Benjamin quote. Probably he didn't, but nevertheless, there is a historical coincidence. This is Benjamin. To articulate what is past does not mean to recognize how it really was. It means to take control of a memory as it flashes in a moment of danger. For historical materialism, it is a question of holding fast to a picture of the past, just as if it had unexpectedly thrust itself in a moment of danger on the historical subject. This is Benjamin, this is what he actually says. And then he goes on to say something which I suspect is maybe in hindsight seen as maybe some kind of a rejoinder to what Benedict Anderson would do with the Benjaminian concept. Social democratic theory, writes Benjamin, and these are all quotations. I'm going to have a number of quotations from the theses of the philosophy of history. A little aside, Benjamin too begins his career working on tragedy, the famous origins of the German tragic drama. And I don't know my theater history, and I was telling Anu that that I'm going to be looking at her. I understand that the Trauerspiel, which is the form that Benjamin uses, is not great theater. Okay, it's not the kind of great masterpieces of tragedy, and I suspect that what he does with Trauerspiel does allow me a sort of ancestry to the Hindi movies and their tragic structure and what I'm going to do with them. I think there's a connection there that I'm hoping to be able to explore. So here's Benjamin. Social democratic theory, and still more the praxis, was determined by a concept of progress which did not hold on to reality, but had a dogmatic claim. Progress, as it was painted in the minds of social democrats, was once upon a time the progress of humanity itself. Not only that of its abilities and knowledges. It was second, something unending, as though progress was going to always happen, in some linear fashion, as essentially unstoppable, self-activating, pursuing a straight or spiral path. Each of these predicates is controversial, says Benjamin, and subject to critique. This latter, the critique that is, must, however, when push comes to shove, go behind all these predicates and direct itself at what they all have in common. The concept of the progress of the human race is history, in history, is not to be separated from the concept of this progression through homogeneous and empty time. Now, a little aside here. When Partha Chatterjee attacks Benedict Anderson, he replaces the idea of homogeneous empty time with what he calls heterogeneous time, the nation and heterogeneous time. I think that's a mistake. I think that we need to hang on to the idea of homogeneous empty time, and this is what I think Benjamin's telling us to do, precisely in order to be able to do what he wants us to do, which is the critique of the concept of this progress must ground its basis, the basis of its critique, on the concept of progress itself. This is thesis 8. And lastly, very quickly, the historical materialist cognizes the sign of a messianic 0 hour of events, or put differently, a revolutionary chance in the struggle for the suppressed past. Again and again, this question of the past comes in. He perceives that in order to explode a specific epoch out of the homogeneous course of history, to explode a specific epoch out of the homogeneity of history, thus exploding a specific life out of the epoch or a specific work out of the life work. This is Walter Benjamin. So the question is, why does this particular film end on tragedy? Why does it end on the exile? Why do these people have to actually not be permitted into this situation? You see this now happening constantly amongst a huge number of filmmakers, actors, and so on, who, let me put it this way, who were Nehruvian, profoundly so, but who weren't exactly celebrating when 1947 happened. Who had a number of concerns, some of them tragic and of a historical kind, but very often this particular idea of there being a paradise, but the paradise ending in tragedy, is something that you will find again and again take place. It's from this that we will now move to the next section of my presentation, which is now literally called The Angel of History, and I have a subtitle, Tere Lahu Se Jaag Uthegi Is Chaman Ki Zindagi. You'll figure out why that is so. There's nothing particularly Nehruvian about Dilip Kumar, other than the fact that most of these stars would have had some kind of an adherence, if you like, to Nehru personally. But I am kind of drawing attention to at least one book by Lord Meghnad Desai, which is titled Nehru's Hero, Dilip Kumar in the Life of India, which explicitly makes that particular point. And Meghnad Desai at that time went on to say, in my view, Dilip Kumar's career is a reflection of the course of India since independence. His roles form a pattern, but a deliberate, consciously chosen pattern by which Dilip Kumar took his status as a role model seriously. As the mood in independent India changed, the screen characters he played also changed. His career took off and rose to its peak during the time, 47 to 64, when Jawaharlal Nehru was India's Prime Minister. 36 of Dilip Kumar's 57 films were made in this time. And it was in this time that Dilip Kumar developed the range of highly popular characters that reflected the idealism and optimism of that period, characters that inspired Indian youth, etc. And after Nehru's death, there was a certain kind of a pessimism. This is Lord Desai's interpretation. I think he's actually quite wrong, because a lot of the tragic structures there very much in the Nehruvian period. Now Dilip Kumar as tragedian is something that we all know. Didar, all kinds of films that do it. And yet I want to actually show you some clips to look at certain other unusual things that are happening there. The Angel of History, his face is turned towards the past. And this is obviously of interest. Where we see the appearance of a chain of events, and this is where historical sort of linearity happens, he sees one single catastrophe. The whole thing is just one single catastrophe, which unceasingly piles rubble on top of rubble and hurls it before his feet. The past, another thesis of Benjamin's, the past carries a secret index with it. Are we not touched by the same breath of air which was amongst that which came before? Is there not an echo of those who have been silenced in the voices to which we lend our ears today? I think it's a really nice line. If so, then there is a secret protocol between the generations of the past and that of our own. For we have been expected upon this earth. For it is given us to know, just like every generation before us, a weak messianic power on which the past has a claim, a weak messianic power on which the past has a claim. This claim is not to be settled lightly. The historical materialist knows why. This is Shaheed. Shaheed happens in 1947, a year after Anmol Ghadi, and Shaheed is again the commercial hit of 1947. Now, Shaheed is, of course, very directly a nationalist film. I mean, so this line, Tere Lahu Se Jaag Uthegi, is from the end of Shaheed. But I want you to look at not the celebratory aspect of the national, but really it's tragic. I mean, I'm just once again interested in the tragic. I want to quote one last statement here on the tragic, which is Raymond Williams on modern tragedy. It has been an issue, and I know that in theatre there has been a concern as to whether tragedy is at all possible in modern times. I mean, is modern circumstances capable of a fully tragic interpretation? Williams, of course, and Benjamin and Brecht, that entire tradition said yes, for somewhat different reasons, I suspect. And here is Williams. He had proposed as a basic condition for modern tragedy a stultification of the object before its transformative relations. The stultification of the object before its transformative relations. The rottenness is in the state, and it is one that the language of politics cannot easily apprehend. So the political language is incapable of working out something that the tragic seems to have. Williams' perception of modern tragedy is that his essential point is that violence and disorder are institutions as well as acts. So these are institutional structures, if you like, as much as they're acts. And this is, I think, an important thing for me to think about as I think back on yesterday's press conference. And that old institutions, now dead, take on their real quality as systematic violence and disorder. In that quality, the source of revolutionary action is seen. This is Williams on modern tragedy. I continue with this specific situation of the conversion of mourning into melancholia, which is, I think, an important problem, if you like, or an important issue that one has to deal with when one looks at, the conversion of national time into tragic time. The distinction between mourning and melancholia is, of course, Freud's, and he talks about how mourning being the successful and proper acceptance of a loss. But I think I want to say something about why the cinema, as against Benedict Anderson's privileged technology of print, which he says is capable of capturing homogeneous empty time, why the cinema is able to capture this time in the way I have tried to define it, with the idea of disruptions, the idea of the messianic, the idea of the past and of the future, which I hope I have been able to show in this film. Two ideas here. One, Judith Butler, on the question of grieving, quite an important sort of work in what is grievable about this world. I mean, what can we grieve about and what can we not? Because obviously we cannot, typically when the state kills, then you're not supposed to grieve, at the person who has been killed, because it's supposed to be in the act of state functioning that, you don't do this. So how do you convert people into grievable entities? She makes a curious connection between that and photography and Roland Barthes' whole question about the photograph. Barthes, she quotes, talks about how, when he shows a photograph of somebody who is going to die, he says, I read it at the same time as this has been and this will be. A photograph, he says, always traps itself into that particular sort of interregnum. By giving the absolute past of the pose, the photograph tells me of death in the future. And this particular relationship between that and grievability was, I think, interesting. Under what conditions that this quality of absolute pastness counter the forces of melancholy and open up a more explicit form of grieving, asks Judith Butler. Is this quality of absolute pastness that is conferred on a living being, one whose life is not yet past, one who's still alive and with us, so to say, precisely the quality of grievability? To confirm that a life was, even within the life itself, is to underscore that a life is a grievable one. In this sense, the photograph, through its relationship to the future anterior, instantiates grievability. And I think there's that kind of grievability structure, if you like, that I think this particular cinema produces. And who it's grieving for is something I will suggest to you later. I have been interested in the idea of linking this kind of idea of past and future and two separate conditions and an unstable situation in between them that the image finds itself within two definitions of realism, and to try and sort of suggest a kind of solved and a kind of an unstable definition of realism as it kind of constantly keeps expanding. The reason for this is actually rather curious. I mean, this was a kind of statement that Yuval Ananthamurthy made when I was in my presence. I mean, he's speaking to many people about how Samskara was read as a realist work. It's really interesting the kind of realisms that are involved. Ananthamurthy was in England when he wrote Samskara. And he wrote it with the idea of reconstructing his land where he came from when he was away from there. You know? So he kind of sort of say reinvents a kind of Kannada in his head and a land that he knew well in order to prove something to himself. Yeah? This is him. And I want to just kind of conclude with two kinds of realism. One, an idea of a kind of a pragmatic realism in which, on the one hand, the natural world and whatever exists within it can be meaningfully discussed or thought about only within a conceptual scheme, linguistic framework or description. And so you will have, I don't know, Satyajit Ray, for example, still saying towards the end of his career that he makes his films for a Bengali audience, that you have to be really speaking Bengali to understand the full nuances of his cinema. It's extremely important for me to draw attention to the fact that the Hindi cinema, particularly in Bombay, was not considered by the independent Indian state as a legitimate form. The S.K. Patil Film Inquiry Committee report that comes out is damning about the impact of the cinema, which it considers largely to be negative. Gandhi himself, it's interesting to know, was against the cinema. I mean, he had this famous run-in with Abbas, who I believe misunderstood Gandhi to think that he was against bad films. Gandhi was not against bad films. Gandhi was against the cinema, period. You know, he did not want or did not like the cinema. Nehru, on the other hand, it's extremely interesting, was very friendly with filmmakers and definitely had ideas about the cinema, but he really thought that the technology of the future was radio. You know, I mean, and there was a kind of an investment, if you like, as David Lelyveld suggests, you know, that at that point of time, the Nehruvian state actually invested in the radio as against in the cinema. And the consequence of this was that the Bombay-based Hindi cinema especially ended up by becoming a kind of a delegitimized and eventually, I want to suggest, diasporic cinema. It was a cinema of migrants from elsewhere. And it had that kind of diasporic structure. You know, I mean, you know, for example, you know, you have situations where, you know, I mean, whether it's A.R. Kardar, Shaukat Hussain Rizvi, Noor Jahan, Ghulam Haider, you know, B.R. Chopra, Pran, Om Prakash Devanand, Balraj Sahani, Geeta Bali, Kamini Kaushal, Rajendra Kumar, and a series of composers, all of them were really speaking from what is today Pakistan. And I'm kind of very interested in a particular phenomenon of how, when you start opening up this form of national time and try and figure out, as Benjamin Wood, what is historical within that time, that curiously, and this is a controversial statement I think I'm making, the Hindi cinema tells you that it was not Indian independence but partition that was a truly important historical occasion. And a lot of these films actually talk about this form of tragic loss in a way that I think wants to speak to that form of loss. That's one possible way in which I can explain this, because you do have situations where people have, for example, said, why are so few films made on the partition in India? And of course, it is true that hardly any films have actually made films themed on the partition. But if you see that particular situation of emigre diasporic cultures as intrinsic to this particular form of the tragic, then I think you get a very different idea of the epic structures of Indian nationalism. So thank you very much.